Imagine this. You are standing in the shadows of the Royal Palace of Madrid on a cold December night in 1808. Your hands tremble as you clutch a letter bearing the royal seal, but the wax feels somehow wrong beneath your fingers. Too soft, too warm. You are a court secretary, barely 23 years old, and tonight you have been summoned to document what the new King Ferdinand VII calls his private devotions. The heavy oak doors creak open, and the stench hits you first. Not the familiar smell of incense and candles you expected, but something organic, something that makes your stomach turn. The king emerges from the shadows, barely 24 himself, with eyes that seem to hold secrets too dark for someone so young. His lips curve into a smile that never reaches those hollow, calculating eyes, and you realize with growing dread that everything you thought you knew about royal propriety is about to be shattered forever. What you don't know yet is that this young monarch, who would rule Spain for most of the 19th century, harbored appetites so twisted and systematic that they would make the Roman emperors seem restrained by comparison. His reign would become a catalogue of horrors hidden behind palace walls, where the most private chambers of power concealed practices that defied every notion of civilization and human decency. Think medieval kings were bad? Think the worst excesses of absolute monarchy happened centuries ago? The truth about Ferdinand VII will make your skin crawl and prove that some forms of human depravity only grew more sophisticated with time. This isn't just the story of a corrupt king. This is the revelation of systematic horrors that make modern scandals look like children's games. Before we dive deeper into these buried histories of power and perversion, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that subscribe button. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told. You're helping preserve these testimonies by staying connected to this journey through history's darkest corners. Ferdinand VII didn't start as a monster. Born in 1784 as the heir to the Spanish throne, he grew up in a court already rotting with corruption and intrigue. His father, Charles IV, was weak and ineffectual, controlled completely by his wife Maria Luisa and her lover, Manuel Godoy. But young Ferdinand learned early that in the Spanish royal household, traditional morality was a facade covering appetites that would horrify ordinary subjects. The boy, who would become history's most depraved monarch, spent his formative years watching his mother conduct open affairs, while his father pretended not to notice. Court records from this period, hidden in Spanish archives for centuries, reveal that Ferdinand's education included more than languages and statecraft. By age 16, he was already being introduced to court traditions that had nothing to do with governance and everything to do with the absolute power that royalty wielded over human bodies and souls. His tutors weren't just teaching him Latin and military strategy. They were preparing him for a world where kings could satisfy any desire, no matter how twisted, because subjects existed solely for royal pleasure. The Spanish Inquisition, still operating during Ferdinand's youth, had taught the monarchy that systematic cruelty could be justified as divine will. Ferdinand absorbed these lessons with an intelligence that would later prove catastrophic for everyone who came within his reach. But here's where Ferdinand's story becomes truly disturbing. Unlike other royal perverts who acted on impulse, Ferdinand was methodical. Court observers noted that even as a teenager, he kept detailed journals of his interests and maintained lists of palace servants who caught his attention. These weren't random acts of royal excess. They were the systematic preparations of someone planning to turn human suffering into a precise art form. The conspiracy that first brought Ferdinand to power in 1808 revealed the depths of ambition that drove his calculated cruelty. When Napoleon invaded Spain, Ferdinand saw opportunity where others saw disaster. While his parents fled into exile, Ferdinand negotiated with the French occupiers, offering his complete cooperation in exchange for recognition as the legitimate king. The deal he struck involved more than political submission. It included providing French officers with entertainments drawn from the Spanish nobility. Contemporary French military records, discovered in archives after World War II, describe elaborate parties at Spanish palaces, where Ferdinand personally supervised the humiliation of aristocratic families who had previously held power over him. Young nobles who had once looked down on the awkward prince now found themselves and their children serving as living decorations at Ferdinand's gatherings, forced to participate in activities that destroyed their dignity and broke their spirits. But this was only the beginning. Ferdinand's collaboration with Napoleon lasted just long enough for him to study French methods of control and extract techniques that he would later perfect during his own reign. When the French were finally expelled in 1814, Ferdinand returned to Madrid not as a liberating hero, but as a monster who had spent 6 years learning how to weaponize absolute power. The Spanish people welcomed Ferdinand VII back as El Deseado, the desired one, believing he would restore traditional values and Spanish independence. They had no idea they were cheering for someone who would spend the next 19 years turning the Spanish monarchy into a laboratory for human degradation. The systematic horrors that followed make the Inquisition look like a model of restraint and mercy. Ferdinand's first act upon reclaiming the throne was to abolish the liberal constitution that had been established during his absence. But this wasn't just political authoritarianism. It was the elimination of any legal protections that might limit his personal appetites. Within months, Ferdinand had restructured the entire court system around his private desires, creating new categories of royal servants whose duties had nothing to do with traditional palace functions. The re-establishment of the Inquisition under Ferdinand's personal control gave him legal mechanisms to kidnap, torture, and kill anyone who might resist his demands. But the Inquisition had always focused on religious orthodoxy. Ferdinand expanded its mandate to include moral purification, which became his cover for systematic sexual predation on a scale that defies comprehension. Court documents from Ferdinand's reign, many still sealed in Spanish archives, reveal the existence of special tribunals that existed solely to provide Ferdinand with victims. These weren't trials in any meaningful sense. They were selection processes where Ferdinand could legally claim anyone who caught his interest. The charges were always heresy or moral corruption, but the real crime was being young, attractive, or vulnerable enough to satisfy the king's appetites. Here's what makes Ferdinand's system truly terrifying. It was completely legal within the structure he created. Parents couldn't protect their children because refusing royal summons was treason. Religious authorities couldn't intervene because Ferdinand controlled the church. Foreign diplomats couldn't object because Ferdinand's Spain was internationally isolated. The monster had created a perfect trap where resistance was impossible and escape was death. Ferdinand's palace became a maze of specialized chambers designed for different forms of entertainment. The throne room, where he conducted official business, connected through hidden passages to rooms that served very different purposes. Diplomatic visitors noted strange sounds echoing through the palace walls, and servants who moved through the corridors with the hollow expressions of people who had seen things that shattered their understanding of human nature. The most disturbing aspect was how systematic everything was. Ferdinand kept detailed records of his activities, not out of guilt or reflection, but as a form of scientific cataloging. He treated human suffering like a collector treating rare specimens, documenting techniques and reactions with the clinical detachment of someone conducting experiments. Court physicians were required to examine subjects before and after encounters with the king, ostensibly for health reasons but actually to document the physical and psychological damage. What you're about to discover about Ferdinand's methods will haunt your dreams. The systematic nature of his predation went far beyond individual acts of cruelty. Ferdinand created entire bureaucracies devoted to finding, preparing, and disposing of victims. The Spanish government, one of Europe's most sophisticated administrative systems, was restructured around facilitating the king's private pleasures. Ferdinand established a network of talent scouts throughout Spain who identified potential subjects for royal attention. These weren't casual selections. They involved detailed demographic surveys, physical examinations, and psychological evaluations. The scouts maintained databases that would be sophisticated even by modern standards, tracking bloodlines, social connections, and personal vulnerabilities that could be exploited to ensure compliance. The transportation system that brought subjects to Madrid was disguised as various legitimate government functions. Some arrived as part of educational programs, supposedly designed to elevate promising young people from the provinces. Others came through religious retreats that promised spiritual advancement. Still others were conscripted through military service or tax obligations that required personal appearance before royal authorities. Once subjects arrived in Madrid, they entered a carefully orchestrated system of preparation that broke down their resistance while maintaining the facade of royal hospitality. Ferdinand had studied the methods used in Turkish harems and Chinese imperial courts, adapting their techniques for psychological manipulation to Spanish conditions. Subjects experienced escalating levels of luxury and comfort that made them dependent on royal favor before they understood what that favor would require. The preparation facilities occupied entire wings of royal properties around Madrid. Subjects lived in comfortable quarters while receiving education in court etiquette, music, languages, and other accomplishments that enhanced their value as entertainment. They were told they were being prepared for prestigious positions in the royal household, and most believed this until the final stages of their initiation. Ferdinand's innovation was creating multiple categories of subjects who served different functions in his systematized depravity. Some were designated as companions, who provided ongoing entertainment over extended periods. Others served as exhibitions, who participated in elaborate ceremonial activities. Still others functioned as experiments, who helped Ferdinand test new techniques and approaches. The companion category involved subjects who lived permanently in the palace complex, technically as members of the royal household but actually as human toys for the king's amusement. These individuals lost all connection to their previous lives, becoming completely dependent on Ferdinand's whims for survival. Many developed Stockholm Syndrome-like attachments to their captor, defending him against criticism and competing desperately for his attention. Ferdinand rotated companions regularly to prevent them from gaining too much influence or developing psychological resistance to his demands. The disposal process was typically disguised as promotions to distant provinces or religious retirements. In reality, most disappeared entirely, their fates recorded only in Ferdinand's private journals that remained sealed for more than a century after his death. The exhibition category involved subjects who participated in Ferdinand's elaborate ceremonial entertainments, often during state occasions or diplomatic receptions. Foreign visitors to Ferdinand's court noted the unusual nature of these celebrations, which seemed to blend political pageantry with activities that made seasoned diplomats physically uncomfortable. Ferdinand forced foreign ambassadors and domestic nobles to witness these exhibitions as demonstrations of royal power and their own helplessness. The message was clear. If the king could do this to Spanish subjects in front of international observers, what might he do to anyone who crossed him? The exhibitions served as both entertainment and terrorism, crushing potential resistance through public displays of absolute authority. But here's where Ferdinand's system reveals its most calculated cruelty. The king maintained detailed psychological profiles of everyone who witnessed his exhibitions, documenting their reactions and using this information to manipulate them later. A diplomat who showed distress might find his country facing economic sanctions. A noble who appeared aroused might be blackmailed into deeper complicity. Ferdinand weaponized every human response to maintain control over his entire social environment. The experimental category represented Ferdinand's most scientific approach to human degradation. These subjects participated in Ferdinand's systematic exploration of psychological and physical torture techniques, many of which were later adopted by Spanish colonial authorities and exported throughout the empire. Ferdinand corresponded with other European monarchs, sharing his discoveries and learning from their innovations in a horrifying exchange of expertise. Court physicians documented the experimental procedures with clinical precision, creating medical records that read like torture manuals disguised as scholarly research. Ferdinand justified these activities as investigations into human nature that would help him govern more effectively. In reality, they were the methodical destruction of human beings for his personal gratification. The most disturbing documents from Ferdinand's reign describe his collaboration with European medical authorities, who provided scientific legitimacy for his experimental program. Prominent physicians visited Madrid to observe Ferdinand's techniques and contribute their own expertise to his research. This created an international network of intellectual complicity that gave Ferdinand's individual sadism the veneer of scientific advancement. Ferdinand's court attracted visitors from across Europe, who came to study what they called Spanish innovations in governance. Many left with detailed notes on techniques they implemented in their own territories. Ferdinand's systematic approach to human degradation became a model that influenced authoritarian practices throughout 19th century Europe, spreading his innovations far beyond Spain's borders. But the most horrifying aspect of Ferdinand's reign was how completely normal it became for everyone involved. Court servants developed elaborate protocols for managing the king's activities. Government ministers integrated the requirements of Ferdinand's personal appetites into routine policy decisions. Foreign diplomats learned to navigate palace social events that included entertainment that would be prosecuted as serious crimes in their home countries. The normalization process was so complete that when Ferdinand died in 1833, many court officials seemed genuinely confused about why the new government dismantled his specialized bureaucracies. They had spent decades treating systematic human degradation as just another aspect of royal administration, no different from managing tax collection or military logistics. Here's what sets Ferdinand VII apart from other historical monsters: the sheer scale and systematic nature of his operations. Unlike rulers who acted on violent impulses, Ferdinand created permanent institutions devoted to facilitating his depravity. His innovations outlasted his reign and influenced authoritarian practices throughout Europe and the Spanish colonies for generations. The Spanish Empire during Ferdinand's reign exported his techniques to colonial territories, where they were adapted for controlling indigenous populations. The systematic dehumanization methods Ferdinand perfected in Madrid became tools of colonial oppression from Mexico to the Philippines. His personal perversions became blueprints for institutional cruelty that affected millions of people across multiple continents. Ferdinand's influence on Spanish Catholicism was equally destructive. By controlling the Inquisition and manipulating religious authorities, Ferdinand corrupted Spanish Christianity into a tool for his personal gratification. Religious ceremonies became covers for his ceremonial entertainments. Moral theology was twisted to justify practices that violated every principle of human dignity. The spiritual damage Ferdinand inflicted on Spanish culture persisted long after his death. The international diplomatic consequences of Ferdinand's reign shaped European politics for decades. Foreign governments that witnessed Ferdinand's court activities lost respect for Spanish civilization and treated Spain as a backwards authoritarian state unworthy of equal treatment. This diplomatic isolation contributed to Spain's decline as a major European power and its eventual loss of most colonial territories. But perhaps the most lasting damage was psychological. Ferdinand's systematic terrorization of Spanish society created trauma that affected multiple generations. Families learned to hide their most vulnerable members from government attention. Parents taught children to be invisible rather than accomplished. The culture of fear Ferdinand created destroyed Spanish social trust and innovation for the rest of the 19th century. The cover-up of Ferdinand's crimes began before his death and continued for more than a century afterward. Spanish governments, the Catholic Church, and European diplomatic archives all participated in hiding evidence of Ferdinand's systematic depravity. The conspiracy of silence protected institutional reputations at the cost of historical truth and justice for Ferdinand's countless victims. Documents revealing the full extent of Ferdinand's crimes were systematically destroyed, hidden, or classified beyond public access. Spanish historians were forbidden from investigating Ferdinand's personal life. Foreign archives sealed diplomatic correspondence that described his court activities. The Catholic Church moved records of Inquisition proceedings to secret archives that remained closed until the late 20th century. When evidence of Ferdinand's crimes finally began emerging in the 1970s and 1980s, many historians initially dismissed it as anti-Spanish propaganda or exaggerated accounts by political enemies. The systematic nature of the cover-up had been so successful that Ferdinand's reputation as merely an incompetent authoritarian persisted, despite overwhelming documentary evidence of his systematic criminality. Even today, many standard histories of 19th century Spain minimize or ignore Ferdinand's personal crimes, focusing instead on his political authoritarianism and economic incompetence. This ongoing historical denial represents the final victory of Ferdinand's cover-up conspiracy, ensuring that his victims remain forgotten while his institutional innovations continue influencing authoritarian practices worldwide. The techniques Ferdinand developed for systematic human degradation didn't disappear with his death. They were preserved in government archives, military manuals, and colonial administrative procedures that influenced authoritarian regimes throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Ferdinand's innovations in bureaucratized cruelty provided blueprints for later dictatorships that refined his methods using modern technology and psychological understanding. Ferdinand VII represents the horrifying intersection of absolute power, systematic intelligence, and complete moral emptiness. Unlike historical monsters who acted on impulse or ideology, Ferdinand approached human degradation as a precise science, requiring continuous research and institutional development. His reign demonstrates how individual depravity can become systematic oppression when combined with sufficient power and administrative sophistication. The king who returned to Spain as El Deseado became history's most systematic practitioner of human degradation, creating institutional frameworks for cruelty that influenced authoritarian practices for generations. His legacy reminds us that the capacity for evil grows more dangerous when combined with intelligence, resources, and the systematic patience to turn individual sadism into permanent institutions of oppression. Standing in that palace corridor in 1808, you couldn't have imagined that the young king whose private devotions you were summoned to document would spend the next 19 years creating a systematic laboratory for human degradation. The letter in your trembling hands was just the beginning of a reign that would redefine the boundaries of institutional cruelty and demonstrate how absolute power corrupts not just individuals, but entire civilizations. Ferdinand VII died in 1833. But his innovations in systematic oppression survived him. The bureaucracies he created, the techniques he perfected, and the institutional frameworks he established continued influencing authoritarian practices long after his death. His personal perversions became governmental policies that shaped Spanish colonial practices and influenced European authoritarianism throughout the 19th century. The most perverted king in history wasn't just an individual monster. He was an innovator whose systematic approach to human degradation provided blueprints for institutional cruelty that continue influencing authoritarian regimes today. Ferdinand's reign demonstrates that the most dangerous historical villains aren't those who commit random acts of violence, but those who transform personal depravity into permanent systems of oppression. If this exploration into the hidden darkness of European monarchy has opened your eyes to the systematic nature of historical oppression, subscribe to continue this journey through history's buried truths. There are countless more stories of institutional cruelty waiting to be told, and these forgotten voices of victims deserve to be heard by those willing to confront the full spectrum of human evil. The young secretary who documented Ferdinand's private devotions on that December night in 1808 could never have imagined he was witnessing the beginning of systematic horrors that would define an entire reign. But his trembling hands and that too warm royal seal were symptoms of a corruption that would spread throughout Spanish civilization, creating institutional frameworks for cruelty that influenced authoritarian practices across Europe and the Spanish Empire for generations to come. Click the subscribe button to ensure these testimonies of systematic oppression continue reaching others who seek to understand how individual evil becomes institutional tyranny. The mystery of Ferdinand VII isn't just how one man could be so systematically depraved. It's how entire civilizations can become complicit in transforming personal perversion into governmental policy that destroys countless lives while maintaining the facade of legitimate authority.